Hey there, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking over White Fang Section 4, the several chapters that are in Part 4 of the novel. So I'm just going to pull out some highlights, some things that I think are worth noticing, kind of talk through it with you a little bit. And then I'm going to be posting a few different videos today because I have a few things that we need to be kind of getting caught up on. So anyway, so White Fang, part 4. So this section was called "The Enemy of His Kind," and as you read, White Fang is made the leader of a sled team, and this really seals his fate as to being hated by the other dogs. He hated being the leader on a sled dog team because to him, in his instincts, it made him feel like he was being chased by other dogs and he was helpless to do anything about it. It was like a nightmare for a dog to be chased by a pack of other dogs, to not be allowed to turn around, not be allowed to engage them, and never be able to get away. So again, you see Jack London's ability to kind of get into the psyche of a dog. And this is not just a dog, it's a wolf. And so all of the wolfish instincts are playing against what it takes to be a sled dog team leader. So even though it's an honor, it's also traumatic for him, kind of on that psychological level. Um, so the he's very much still an outsider. There's an allusion to a Bible character here. And it says how White Fang had led an Ishmaelite life up until this point. An Ishmaelite life is has a dual layer to the meaning of that reference. One thing is it just means simply a nomadic life. The Ishmaelites in the Old Testament were a group of tent-dwelling nomadic tribesmen. And so it was the idea of having no permanent home, moving from place to place. But there was more to it than that. Ishmael was born, if you're, the patriarchs of the Hebrew nation, whereas Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob, and then it moved on from there. But those are the three patriarchs. And Abraham had been promised by God that he would have a son, and that through that son he would have countless descendants, and his name would be known forever. And that son was promised to him even though his wife Sarah was barren, unable to have children. And so over the years, God had made that promise to Abraham, but over the years, Abraham grew impatient waiting for the fulfillment of that promise. And it was actually Sarah's idea. She gave her Egyptian handmaiden to her husband Abraham to conceive a child with her on their behalf. And so then the promised son would come through this kind of contrived arrangement through her handmaiden. So that is how Ishmael came to be born. He was the child who should never have been. He was not the promised one. It turned out that 12 years after Ishmael was born, Isaac was an actual biological child of Abraham and Sarah, and he was born, and he was the child of promise. And so Ishmael is described in the Old Testament as being a wild donkey of a man. He had to be sent away from Isaac because Sarah did not want her son to grow up alongside this now what she considered an illegitimate heir. So he was only half Jewish. He was also half Egyptian, which is pagan. And so that was you can see White Fang, half wolf, half dog. So there was this kind of mixed breeding. There was this unwanted, unplanned, this not belonging, this being sent away, and then also this wandering homelessness. So all of these things pack into this allusion to White Fang living an Ishmaelite life. Little shameless plug for my Allusions and Allegories class, which is going to be running this summer, possibly online. But that's the kind of little layer of meaning that if you're not familiar with the Bible story behind the allusion, you miss the reference altogether, and you just don't get the point. So it opens up a lot more to a piece of literature when you can pick up on those little details. Anyway, so Let's see. We have White Fang also now, as they're moving from place to place with Gray Beaver. They're going to a camp with the gold miners. This is during the time of the gold rush. So now you have White Fang is encountering white men for the first time. He has been among the kind of like, they were called in the book Indian tribes, Gray Beaver, teepee dwelling tribal people. And now he sees the white man, and he sees them as the gods above gods. Now, on the first thing, we're like, oh, that's so racist, the white people. But interestingly, the White Fang's reasoning is explained to us, and it isn't a racial superiority as much as what White Fang observes is that the white men had made greater mastery over matter. So, from the dog's perspective, he doesn't have any concept of race, but he sees where the tribe had teepees. These are permanent houses where the tribes lived in small villages and uprooted and moved around. These white men live in towns that are established, so he can recognize that there is a more sophisticated use of technology, of matter, than the people that he had been dwelling with before. So it's just, again, just his observation from the perspective of White Fang. He also has his first exposure to pet dogs, to domesticated dogs. And you can see that he has no respect or use for the domesticated breeds. They are weak, they're silly looking, they're all out of proportion, their bodies aren't functional. And it's kind of funny, again, we don't think about how domesticated dogs have kind of been bred out of their dogness. But that's very much what White Fang, he just kind of thinks that they're just this kind of clownish breeds. He also, continues to get into fights with other dogs. He ends up killing the white men's dogs by attacking them, and then getting the other sled dogs worked into a frenzy, so they go in for the kill so that they get blamed, but he's the one that's actually instigating it. So again, just very antisocial behavior. Moving into the next chapter, we have the chapter is called The Mad God, and this is where we meet Beauty Smith. And Beauty is ironically named because he is a monstrous deformity of a man, as the book tells us. The physical description of him is very creative, very rich in metaphor and simile, but basically he's a very, very unattractive man. He's also an evil, evil man. He's a vicious, violent, cruel, sadistic man. And White Fang senses this evil in him, and he hates and fears him instinctively. And as you know, if you've read, Gray Beaver refuses to sell White Fang to Beauty, even though Beauty really wants to acquire him, and ends up, because of Gray Beaver's extreme drunkenness, Beauty ends up getting the upper hand of a deal and ends up with White Fang, which is a tragedy for White Fang. So there's an interesting quote when we're thinking nature versus nurture near the end of this chapter about Beauty. It says, Beauty had not created himself, and no blame was attached to him for his ugliness, for his cruelty. His twisted body and his brute intelligence, it refers to these as the clay of him. He's not been kindly molded by the world. So you have the raw materials that nature provided him with. He was at a disadvantage because he was ugly, not intelligent, and then he was badly treated by the world, which then brought out the cruelty. So we're seeing the idea of the clay and the molding again, but this time attributed to a human being rather than to White Fang as an animal. So you got to ask yourself, is that a fair leap to make from the animal world to the human world. Is Beauty Smith really off the hook for being a horrible person just because nature dealt him a crummy hand and he had tough circumstances? That's part of what the author wants us to be thinking about and evaluating as we read. He's making a comparison between Beauty and White Fang, and he's asking us to use our judgment of what do we think. Is that a fair comparison? So once Beauty acquires White Fang, it begins he uses him as a fighting dog for money. And, the men all gather around and they have their dog fights and they bet money. And White Fang is the uncontested victor for a long time. He beats every single kind of dog that's brought against him, so that it's almost hard to even find dogs to fight him because he has beaten them all. But then when we move into chapter 4, we can see trouble is coming. And again, very quickly, because this video, I have to keep it under 15 minutes or I won't be able to upload it. But in chapter 4, it's called The Clinging Death. And we saw the fight between the bulldog and White Fang. And even though the bulldog looked like he would be an easy victim, when he got that hold on White Fang's neck, it was pretty much over. The bulldog's jaws are just like a vice, and there was no way he was going to let go. It was just a matter of biting in deeper and deeper until he hit the jugular, and then that's it, death. Now, in the midst of this fight, which is an unfair, badly matched fight, two men come storming in, and you read it. It's kind of a great scene. They intimidate all the other men because they have the moral high ground. These are good guys, and everyone else knows it. And they end up stopping the fight, prying the jaws of the bulldog off. And Weedon Scott forces Beauty to sell White Fang to him. And so now White Fang is with a good master. Initially, you can see White Fang struggles. He's afraid of the master. He bites by accident. His instincts. He bites. He nips out. He's afraid of the hands of any man because he's been beaten so terribly. He won't take meat from the master's hand. He's very suspicious and nervous about the kind tone of voice. He's expecting it's a trick and that there's going to be some terrible punishment. The kindness is very difficult for him at first. The kind voice, the petting by his hand is distasteful to his instincts, yet it's also very pleasant. It's the beginning of the end for White Fang, the end of the old life, the reign of hate that he's been experiencing. What's happening is a revolution for him. It's running counter to all of his previous experiences. So it took a lot of work and a lot of patience for Weedon Scott to win White Fang over, but in the end he does. And White Fang's love progresses first from liking, just a preference for this new master over the old one. Then it moves into duty, where he takes up his role to protect Weedon's property. And then there's this longing that awakens in him, the longing and responsiveness to the love of this God. And there's a change in his code of conduct. Whereas White Fang used to do everything in order to avoid pain and seek comfort, now he wants to be with the God no matter what, even if it means giving up a warm bed or a meal to be near him. So his nature is changing. Something is changing deep inside him. And then one thing is that he can't seem to express his love back the way other dogs do. He can't bark a happy greeting. He can't wag his tail initially. And then there's this one incident where where Scott goes away, and then White Fang pines for him. And when he comes back, he places his head under Scott's arm as this ultimate sign of submission. So there's a huge turning point in the end of the chapter. Beauty Smith comes and tries to steal White Fang back, and White Fang fights him off. And Weedon Scott is kind of glad because he knows that he's really won over White Fang's love and loyalty. So big turning point and some really interesting things coming up in part 5, the final segment of this of the reading. So I hope you're enjoying it, still thinking about these same themes, nature versus nurture. Now we have White Fang in an entirely new environment. How is that going to impact who he is? Looking forward to what you post, and I'll be in touch.